The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
It's coming.
All these voices. All these voices. All these things you can't explain. All these painful memories. They keep haunting you and daunting me. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a ghost of you and me. Of you and me. All these whispers.
My name is James Hershey. Right back.
All these shadows in my mind. My reflection I can't find. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a
That ought
ghost
to do
of
it.
you and me. Of you and me. Don't let 'em take you away. Don't let 'em bring you down inside. It's just the mirrors in your mind. Don't let 'em bring you down.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Staring into the Abyss. I'm your host, horror author James Hershey Jr., and with me, as always, my co-host, old boy James Ash. How you doing, brother?
Pretty good, and how's everybody's night going?
Tonight's episode is one that we thought about doing a while ago, but the guy that we're doing this episode about died, and we didn't want to do it right as he died or right after he died because we didn't want to kind of be riding on those coattails of his death. Because I wanted it to be a look at his entire life and to try to figure out why he did the things that he did. You know, what led up to them, what shaped him and his mind. And if you do it right when the guy dies, then everybody thinks, okay, you're just doing that because he was super popular and now he's dead. So I wanted a little bit of space. So tonight's show is going to be on Charles Manson, who was very sick, very deranged, but also fascinating. And he had such an impact on popular culture. And I've always wondered why we are so obsessed with such damaged and sick people. Because, I mean, in all reality, that's what Manson was a sick, sick guy. But for some reason, we just can't get enough of him as a culture. You know, there's t-shirts with him on it, everything. So I guess in the beginning here, I'm going to say right away that we in no way approve of or endorse mass murder or anything like that, okay? So don't get all upset. What I want to do is look at his life and try to figure out what was so fascinating about Manson and what led up to him murdering a bunch of people. I mean, he didn't really murder a bunch of people. His family did because he ordered them to, but you get the idea. So we got a whole lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. He was born November 12th, 1934. And it's kind of funny because when he was born, he didn't actually have a name for a couple weeks. He was actually listed as No Name Maddox on his birth certificate, and then in a few weeks, they actually came up with a name for him, and it was Charles Mills Maddox, was what it was. His mom's name was Kathleen Maddox, and he was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. For a period after his birth, his mother was married to a laborer whose name was William Eugene Manson. That's where Charles got his last name. But Eugene was not his biological father. It was just the man that his mother was married to. His biological father was a gentleman named Colonel Walker Scott. We know that because his mother Kathleen filed a paternity suit against Colonel Walker Scott in 1937 and got a judgment. So it is entirely possible that Charles Manson never actually knew his biological father. There is no real answer to that question. We don't know for sure. the thing with Charles Manson is he's given a whole lot of interviews and he's talked a whole lot about his past, but his story always changes. So we never quite know what the truth is about his early childhood and his past because he kind of makes it up as he goes along, basically. One interesting thing about Colonel Walker Scott, though, is in Charles Manson's 1953 case file from the National Training School for Boys, where he spent 7 months locked up, it talks about his dad. And in the report, it basically says that Colonel Scott was black. The first 2 sentences of the background section on his paperwork said, and I quote, "Father unknown. He is alleged to have been a colored cook by the name of Scott, who got promiscuous with Charles's mother at the time of her pregnancy." Charlie was actually asked about this, about whether his father was black, by Vincent Bugliosi, the guy who tried the case against Manson and the family in 1971. Manson denied that his father was black, and he emphatically denied that his father was black. It really pissed him off that that was being questioned. The way he reacted, it seemed like he had been asked that question before, and he really did not like it. Remember that little fact, because later on when we start talking about motive and the reasons for the murders, that'll come into play again. Now, the 1920 and the 1930 census, they list Colonel Scott as white. So chances are, according to official documents, he was listed as white. So chances are he was actually white. But I think that paperwork from the Boys Town, I think that really followed Charlie throughout his life. And that idea that his father was black, I think he got picked on about that. I think that was a sore spot for him. And it plays later on into his life. In his biography, Manson, in his own words, Colonel Scott is said to have been a young drugstore cowboy, a transient laborer working on a nearby dam project. That's what it says in the book. Basically, after giving birth in Cincinnati, his mom ran away to Kentucky. And there's no real mention of what happened to Manson's biological father after that. But they went to Kentucky, and Manson's mom and her brother, so that's Charles Manson's uncle, ended up getting sentenced to 5 years in prison because they robbed a service station in Charleston, West Virginia in 1939. And the way they robbed this service station is kind of hilarious because they used a ketchup bottle. They brandished a ketchup bottle like it was a gun and robbed the liquor store. I mean, not the liquor store, the service station, I'm sorry. After they were arrested, Manson was placed with his aunt and his uncle in West Virginia. When Manson's mom was paroled in 1942, she went and picked Charles up, and he lived with her in hotels. And they were like run-down, seedy, nasty hotels. Charles Manson claims that during this time period when they were living in hotels and stuff like that, that he was actually living above a whorehouse, and there were prostitutes coming and going all the time. And that's where he learned to be a pimp and to pimp out women to make himself money. That's where he says that comes from. In 1947, Kathleen Maddox tried to have her son placed in a foster home because she wasn't able to take care of him, and she frankly didn't want to be bothered with him anymore. She wasn't able to place him in a foster home because they didn't have any available at the time. So she still wanted to get rid of him, so the court ended up placing Manson in the Gabalt School for Boys, which was in Indiana. He lasted there about 10 months before he just ran away. He wanted to go back to his mom, so he split. He ran away from there and made his way back to his mom, and his mother rejected him and threw him out and told him she didn't want him. So Manson was kind of out on his own, didn't have a place to stay, didn't have food, didn't have anything. So he turned to crime. That's when he started breaking the law. He started out by burglarizing a liquor store, and that got him money so that he could rent a room. It worked out well for him, so he decided that was going to be the way that he made money from now on. So he started doing burglaries at a bunch of other stores, and one of them he stole a bike, but he was eventually caught while burglarizing a store, and he was sent to juvenile hall in Indianapolis. He was there for a grand total of 1 day, and then he escaped. He ran away, and he was quickly recaptured and he was placed in Boys Town. Now, 4 days after he got to Boys Town, him and another boy that he had met while he was there escaped. And they committed 2 armed robberies while they're on their way to the other boy's uncle's house. They got caught during the second robbery. It was at a grocery store, and arrested again. And then Manson, he was like, 13 at this time. He was sent to the Indiana boys' school, where, according to Manson, he was brutalized sexually and otherwise. So he was beaten, and he was raped and fondled, and all kinds of horrible things happened to him there, according to him. There are no actual records of that. There's no paperwork stating that happened. No reports were filed, but that's what Manson says happened. He tried to escape from there multiple times, and he kept failing. And then finally, in 1951, him and 2 other boys were actually able to escape. They fled Indiana, and they made it all the way to Utah, where they were actually caught on the way to California. They were trying to get to California, but they got caught in Utah in the cars that they stole. They robbed several gas stations along the way as they went. And the fact that they had driven in a stolen car from Indiana to Utah turned out to be a very, very bad thing, because that actually meant that they had committed a federal crime. Okay, so instead of just having the robberies to answer for, the act of transporting a stolen car across state lines is a violation of the Dreyer Act. So that's a federal crime. And because of that, Manson was sent to Washington, D.C., to the National Training School for Boys. Even though he was a smart boy, he couldn't read or write. And in the psychological reports that were filed by the caseworker there, they labeled him as aggressively antisocial. So this is the first time in the record that we see Charles Manson being labeled as aggressive and antisocial and a problem. More than just a criminal, but this is where he's starting to get dangerous. In October 1951, on the recommendation of a psychiatrist, Manson was transferred over to the Natural Bridge Honor Camp, which was a minimum security institution. From there, he was transferred to Petersburg, Virginia, to the Federal Reformatory, and he was seen by the psychiatrist there as well. And the psychiatrist there labeled him as dangerous. So he's went from aggressively antisocial to now he's labeled as dangerous. So he's gotten worse. In September of 1952, he ended up getting transferred to a federal reformatory in Ohio because he had multiple serious disciplinary offenses. About a month after the transfer, he really started behaving himself, and he became like a model prisoner. He was doing his jobs that they gave him without giving him any problems, and he was actually taking classes there. And he was able to raise his educational level from the lower 4th to the upper 7th grade. And that ended up ensuring that he would receive a parole in May of 1954. For a very short time after that, he behaved himself, and he was good. He honored his parole, and he lived with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia, which was one of the terms of his parole. But that didn't last very long, because he ended up moving back in with his mom, who also lived in West Virginia at the time. And in January of 1955, he got married to a hospital waitress whose name was Rosalie Jean Willis. He was happy. Manson said himself that he was happy during this time. Now he had a wife that he had to take care of, so he would go get little small part-time jobs as he could find them, and then he also stole cars on the side to help raise money to support his wife and himself. Around October, which was about 3 months after him and his wife arrived in LA in a stolen car, once again he was arrested and charged with a federal crime, which was the Dreyer Act like we talked about earlier. He got charged again for the same thing. The thing that made this worse for him was that his wife was now pregnant, and they gave him another psychiatric evaluation, and he was given 5 years of probation. But he failed to appear at an LA hearing. He ended up getting arrested in March of 1956. His probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison at Terminal Island, which is in San Pedro, California. Now, while Manson was in prison, Rosalie gave birth to their son. They named him Charles Manson Jr. during his first year at Terminal Island, his wife and his mom both came and visited him. And they were actually living together at the time in L.A. This was March of 1957. Then all of a sudden, the visits from his wife stopped. His mother kept coming to see him, but his wife stopped coming. Charlie, he asked his mom what was going on with that, why his wife wasn't coming to visit him anymore. And his mom told him that Rosalie was living with another man now. Manson had a parole hearing in 2 weeks, but this news really upset him. And so he tried to escape by stealing another car. And he was caught, and he was given 5 years more probation, and his parole was denied. In 1958, he got out, he received 5 years parole, and Rosalie filed for divorce. And by November of 58, he was pimping out a 16-year-old girl, and he was getting other money from another girl that had wealthy parents. In September of 1959, he pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check. And he said that he stole that from a mailbox. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation again. There was a young woman who had an arrest record for prostitution. Some people say that she was one of the girls that Charlie was pimping out that the authorities didn't know about. Some people say that that's not true. I'm not sure what the answer is there either. I don't think there's really any way to know. Only he really knows the answer to that, him and her. And you can't really believe what Charlie says because he lies so much. But anyway, he was given the 10-year suspended sentence and the probation because this young woman made a tearful plea to the judge saying that she was deeply in love with Manson, that her and Manson were madly in love, and that if they let Charlie go with just the probation, that they were going to get married and settle down, and there would be no more trouble. Before the end of that year, Manson did marry the woman. But I don't think that was really love. I think it was more that because she was his wife, she could not be required to testify against him in court. I think most likely that was what was behind that. This woman's name was Leona, and when she was a prostitute, she used the name Candy Stevens. Manson took her and another woman from California to New Mexico for prostitution, and he was stopped by the police and he was held and questioned for a violation of the Mann Act. They let him go, but Manson just had a bad feeling. He felt like it wasn't over, like he hadn't seen the last of the cops and that they were going to be after him. So he just disappeared. He took off and violated his probation. Because he left, they issued a bench warrant, and in April of 1960, they got an indictment for the violation of the Mann Act, and Manson was arrested. They arrested him in Laredo, Texas, and then Manson was returned to L.A. For the violation of probation and on the check cashing charge, the judge ordered him to serve the 10-year sentence that was originally suspended. So he had to serve that 10 years. In July of 1961, after he spent a year trying to appeal the revocation of his probation, Manson was transferred from the LA County Jail to the penitentiary at McNeil Island. That's what happens when you're trying to appeal and then the appeal gets denied and then now you have to start serving your sentence. During the appeal process, he was kept in the county jail. Once the appeal process was over and it was time for him to actually begin his sentence, then they sent him to the penitentiary. While he was there, he ended up taking guitar lessons from the Barker Karpus gang leader, Alvin Creepy Karpus. And he actually got a contact name of someone at Universal Studios from an inmate named Phil Kaufman. And according to Jeff Gwynn's 2013 biography of Manson, Charlie's mother moved from California to Washington State to be closer to him during his stay in the penitentiary. And she worked nearby as a waitress, so she was still able to come see Charlie. Although the Mann Act charge had been dropped, the attempt to cash a treasury check was still a federal offense. So in September of 1961, he underwent a review, and they wrote in the review that Charlie had a tremendous drive to call attention to himself. And in September of 1964, they basically said the same thing about him. In 63, his wife Leona was granted a divorce. June of 1966, Manson was sent again to Terminal Island, so that they were getting ready to give him an early release. That's why he was sent there. March 21st, 1967, that was his release day. By that time, he had spent more than half of his 32 years of life in prison and other institutions. So when you count up like the penitentiary, the county jail, and the different juvenile halls and boys' homes he had been in, I mean, he had spent over half of his life in prison at that time. And mainly that was because of the federal laws that he had broke, with the treasury check and with transporting the stolen car across state lines, because federal law carries a much stiffer sentence than a state offense. When they got ready to release him, Charlie told the authorities that prison had become his home and he didn't want to be released. He requested to stay, and they refused, and they actually made him be released. They sent him away. Manson in 67, after he was released, he got permission to move to San Francisco, and he moved into an apartment in Berkeley. Now, this is the beginning of where Manson begins to figure out who he's going to be and starts to recruit his following. He actually went to Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, which during that time was like hippie central. Okay, this was in 67. It was a summer of love, and that was the spot to be for the hippie counterculture during that time period. And Manson got in with this culture, and he kind of liked it because it was all about free and love, and you didn't have to pay for things. They would just give you stuff, and he was really into that. So he kind of reinvented himself from a pimp and a con man and a criminal to like a guru. He kind of took his philosophy that he started preaching as a guru from several different sources. One was from the Process Church, and the members of the Process Church believed that Satan would be reconciled to Christ, and that they would come together at the end of the world to judge all of humanity. And he also mixed that with Scientology that he had studied in prison. And with that philosophy that he formed as a mesh of the two, he began to gather followers to him. The majority of them were female followers. A little interesting side note, when Manson was put into prison in 61, he listed Scientologist as his religion. Manson taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians, and that the Romans were the establishment in America. You know, the government, the authority figures. He strongly implied that he was Christ. And one of the things that he would do was he would get his family, which was all of his followers, he would get them all high on LSD. And then he would tell a story where he envisioned himself on the cross with nails in his feet and his hands. And he would walk them through this process and dance it out and act it out while everybody was high on LSD. And it kind of made it real in their minds that Charlie was Christ. And that's one of the ways he used a lot of drugs to keep a hold of his followers. So he used drugs and he used sex. With the women, he used drugs and the feeling that he was Christ. And he convinced the women to have sex with the men that he had brought into his group of followers in order to attract the men and to keep them there. He even began using an alias, Charles Willis Manson. And when he said it very slow. So the way Charlie would have said it was, instead of Charles Willis Manson, it would be Charles Will is man's son. So through that he was implying that his will was the same as that of the Son of Man, which is Jesus Christ. Before the summer ended, Manson and 8 or 9 of his followers piled into an old school bus that they had remade to look like, like a hippie bus. And they had like colored rugs and pillows in place of the seats because they pulled all those out. And they went as far north as Washington State. And then they moved back down south towards LA and Mexico, and then southwest. They toured all around that area. And they ended up living in Topanga Canyon in Malibu, and they also lived in Venice. In 1967, Brunner became pregnant by Manson. And on April 15th, 1968, gave birth to a son she named Valentine Michael, but they all called him Pooh Bear. She gave birth in a condemned house, actually, in Topanga Canyon. She was assisted during the birth by the women of the family. And by the family, I mean Manson's followers. Brunner was a member of the group, and like most members of the group, she had like a bunch of different nicknames that they called her, one of which was Mother Mary and Mary Manson. That's kind of a play on Mother Mary from the Bible and Mary Magdalene from the story of Christ. At this point, you can kind of see how he is building this family, and he is building himself up as a Christ-like figure that absolutely must be obeyed in all things. This was how he was able to get his followers to do whatever he said. This is also the point in time where we start entering the home stretch that would lead up to the murders. The events that would end up culminating in the murders were set into motion in late spring of 1968 when Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys picked up two of the Manson women who were hitchhiking. That was Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey. And he brought them back to his house in Pacific Palisades for a few hours. And he took them back home early in the morning after like a recording session that he was doing. And he was greeted in the driveway of his own house when he returned by Manson, who actually walked out of his house. So when he got back to his own driveway, Manson was in his house and walked out. Wilson was obviously uncomfortable and kind of shocked by this, and he asked Manson if he was going to hurt him. Manson said, "No, I'm not going to hurt you," and he kept assuring him that he wasn't. And then Manson actually got down on the ground and began kissing Wilson's feet. And in doing that, he was replicating the acts of Jesus when he would kiss his followers' feet. Inside the house, Wilson discovered 12 strangers, who were most of them were women. They kind of didn't leave for a long time. Months, in fact. Over the next few months, more and more of the family members showed up and made themselves at home. They cost Wilson right around $100,000 to keep them and all that kind of stuff. And this actually included a large medical bill for the treatment of gonorrhea for the family members. And $21,000 of it was because some family members accidentally destroyed his car when they borrowed it. Wilson would sing and talk with Manson, and the women would act like servants, sexually and in every other way of getting them food and getting them all the stuff. Wilson actually paid for studio time to record songs with Manson. So they were songs that Manson had written and actually sang the songs as well. And Wilson introduced Manson to a lot of the people that he knew in the entertainment business. Some of those people were like Greg Jacobson, Terry Melcher, who is going to be important later in this story as well, Rudy Altobelli. And Rudy Altobelli actually owned a house that he ended up renting to actress Sharon Tate and her husband, who was the director Roman Polanski. He was impressed by the whole package of Charlie Manson, all of it. You know, how, the artistry, the lifestyle, the philosophy that he had, and he paid money to record Manson as well. Manson says that he met Wilson at a bar when he went to buy weed, and that the drummer actually gave Manson the address and invited him to come on by. So that's what Manson says happened, but the accepted version of it is Wilson's story, which we just told. From there, the family went to Spahn Ranch. That was an old movie set ranch. They did that in 1968. They lived there on the ranch for free, and they all the women kind of served the owner of the Spahn Ranch, and they were kind of like his friends, his servants. They flirted with him a lot. They did a lot of work around the grounds. They did the upkeep of the place, the mowing, all that kind of stuff. They would actually have sex, some of the women, with George Spahn, who owned the ranch. He was 80 years old and almost blind. The women would act like his seeing eye girls, and they'd like lead him around the ranch. And when Charlie said to, they would have sex with him, and that enabled them to live there for free. They moved from there to Death Valley, where they occupied two different ranches, the Myers and the Barker Ranch. The Myers Ranch was actually owned by the grandmother of a woman who was in the family, and the Barker Ranch was owned by an elderly local woman who Manson had claimed he was a musician, and that's how he presented himself to her, and that they needed a place to go to work on an album that they were doing. And so they agreed to let them stay if they worked on the place and fixed it up for them. Manson showed his appreciation to her by giving her one of the Beach Boys gold records that he had actually gotten from Dennis Wilson, because Dennis Wilson had given him several of them. In December, Charles Manson and Tex Watson went to Topanga Canyon and visited a friend of theirs who played them the Beatles' White Album. It had just come out. This played a pivotal role in Manson's life as well, because the theory behind the murders was that was come up by the prosecution was Helter Skelter. That the song Helter Skelter, that Manson believed that it was referring to a race war that was going to happen. He believed that the black people were going to rise up and have a race war with the white people, and that the black people would defeat the white people. They would come out on top of the war and win and kill everybody. But Charlie believed that the black people were too stupid to rule themselves. After the blacks had won the race war, and during the race war, Charlie and his family were going to be down in Death Valley at the ranch, hiding out. And then after the race war was over, they would come out of the Death Valley, out of the hiding, and they would rule the whole world, because the black people would recognize that they needed a white man to rule them because they were too stupid to do themselves. That is a theory of what Charlie believed was going to happen, that he got from Helter Skelter, which was the Beatles song. It seems kind of crazy, but then again, Manson was crazy. March 23rd of 1969, Manson went to Sharon Tate's house, which he knew as Melcher's residence, but now Sharon Tate was living there. Melcher was no longer there. He was met by Hatami, who was a photographer and one of Sharon Tate's friends. He was actually there to take pictures of Sharon Tate before she left for Rome the next day. He saw Manson coming up to the house, and he went out and confronted him on the porch and asked what he wanted. Manson told him that he was looking for Melcher, and Hatami told him that he didn't live there anymore. Manson asked where he was, and Hatami said he didn't know where he had moved to. And Manson kept asking and he just kept saying the same thing. Sharon Tate came out to see what was going on, and Manson asked her, and she said that she didn't know either. And so that was the first meeting between Charles Manson and Sharon Tate. That evening, Manson returned to the property, and he went back to the guest house, because he had went to the guest house and he had asked if they knew where Melcher was, and they said that they didn't either. And so that evening, he went back to the guest house, and he was going to go in and see if he could find him. The guy, Rudy Altobelli, who lived there, was just getting out of the shower. And Manson again asked for Melcher, and he again was told that Melcher wasn't there. Altobelli told Manson that Melcher had ended up moving to Malibu. He lied to him and said that he didn't know what his new address was. And Manson asked when he was going to be back, and he told him that it would be at least a year before he returned. Altobelli said he was going out of the country as well the next day, and Manson said, "Okay, well, when you get back, I want to talk to you again." And Altobelli told him, "No, I'm not going to be back for at least a year." That was a lie, but he didn't want to see Manson again because Manson was kind of freaking him out, and he asked Manson not to disturb his tenant, Sharon Tate or Roman Polanski. Manson left, and Tate and Altobelli went to Rome the next day, and Tate actually asked him on the plane whether that creepy-looking guy, meaning Manson, had come back. So she was kind of having a bad feeling about it. In '69, Terry Melcher visited Spawn Ranch to hear Manson and the women sing. And while he was there, he had brought a friend with him who had a mobile recording unit, but he didn't actually record the group himself. By June, Manson had started telling the family that the blacks weren't going to rise up quick enough. He might have to show the blacks how they were going to have to start Helter Skelter, because they were too stupid even to figure out how to start the race war. But they needed money, so Manson tasked Tex Watson to go out and find money. They ended up ripping off a black drug dealer named Bernard Crow. Crow didn't take that very well. He said he'd wipe out everybody at Spawn Ranch. Because he said that, July 1st of 1969, Manson shot Crow at his apartment in Hollywood. He thought that Crow was a Black Panther, and so that really freaked him out, thinking that he was going to have massive retaliation from the Black Panthers. So basically he turned Spawn Ranch into like a defensive military camp where he had armed guards and patrols, and he really at this point believed that Helter Skelter was going to happen any moment. On July 25th, 1969, Manson sent Bobby Bousselet and Mary Brunner and Susan Atkins to Gary Hinman's house because Manson had heard that Hinman had received an inheritance of a lot of money and Manson wanted the money. So he sent them there to get it. The three people held Hinman hostage for 2 days. During that time period, Manson showed up and he had a sword with him and he slashed Hinman's ear with it. And then Bobby Bousselet stabbed Hinman to death when Manson told him to. They never did get the money, but before they left, one of them, I don't know if it was Bobby Bousselet or one of the women, used Hinman's blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall. And then they drew a panther paw, which was the Black Panther symbol. This was going to play in later as well into the murders because they put stuff on the wall there. August 9th, 1969, Charles Manson ordered Tex Watson to take Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel to Melcher's former home and kill everybody that was there. He told the women to listen to Tex. The family members went there and they killed 5 people that were there. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski, who was visiting her, and Stephen Parent, who was actually just visiting the caretaker. He was shot outside in the car. Atkins wrote "pig and blood" on the front door as they left. This murder, it created a nationwide sensation, as you can imagine, because it was celebrities and rich people that got killed. And it really freaked everybody out. Celebrities started hiring all these extra security and stuff like that. But he wasn't done, because the next night, which was August 10th of 1969, he sent 6 family members, Leslie Van Houten, Stephen Grogan, who they called Clem, and the 4 that had went to the Tate residence. And Manson actually went with them this time, and they drove around looking for another victim. Manson wasn't too happy how the murder went down the night before because there was a lot of panic, there was a lot of confusion, and some of the victims actually were able to make it out of the house and were killed on the lawn. So he wanted to show them how it was done properly. They rode around for a few hours, and he considered a bunch of different houses before he finally settled on one of them. They went to 3301 Waverly Drive, and this was the home of a supermarket executive named Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary, who owned or co-owned a dress shop. This was in LA. It was right next door to a house where Manson and his family members had actually attended a party the previous year. According to Atkins and Kasabian, Manson went up the driveway and went into the home, and then he came back out a little bit later. Manson told them that he had tied the people up and that they were supposed to go in there and to kill them. Manson had told Lino and his wife that if they just cooperated, everything would be fine. It wouldn't be hurt, and they allowed him to tie him up. He sent the girls in and the rest of them in to kill everybody. They brought other weapons with them as well to this. They actually brought I'm trying to remember, I believe it was a chrome-plated bayonet that they brought with them. I know it was a bayonet, I believe it was chrome-plated. And they actually used that bayonet to stab into Lino's throat. The sounds of the scuffle in the bedroom drew Tex Watson there, and he saw Rosemary was keeping the women at bay and fighting them off because she was swinging this lamp that Manson had tied around her neck. She was swinging it at the girls. He went over and he stabbed her several times with the bayonet, and she kind of stopped swinging and the girls took over, and he went back out to the living room and kept on attacking Lino, who he stabbed a total of 12 more times with the bayonet. When Lino was dead, Watson carved the word "war" on his abdomen. And he went back to the bedroom and he found Patricia Krenwinkel was stabbing Rosemary LaBianca with a knife that she had got from the kitchen. Manson had told him that he wanted each of the women to be involved in the murder. So Watson told Leslie Van Houten that she had to stab Mrs. LaBianca as well. And so Van Houten stabbed her 16 times in the back and the butt. During the trial, Van Houten claimed that Rosemary was dead when she stabbed her. And the evidence showed that Miss LaBianca had 41 stab wounds, and some of them had actually been inflicted after she died. So whether she was alive or not isn't clear, but it's possible that she was already dead. Watson cleaned off the bayonet and took a shower in the home, and while Patricia Krenwinkel wrote Rise and Death to Pigs on the walls and Helter Skelter on the refrigerator door in LaBianca's blood. She gave Lino 14 wounds, puncture wounds, with a carving fork that had an ivory handle, and she actually left it sticking out of his stomach. And she took a steak knife and shoved that into his throat and left it. While this was happening, Manson was hoping for a double murder that night. So he directed Kasabian to drive to this actor friend of hers' house in Venice. And he deposited another 3 family members there at that apartment building and drove back to the Spawn Ranch. And they were supposed to go in there and kill them and then hitchhike back home. Kasabian didn't want to kill her friend, so she actually went to the wrong door on purpose and knocked on that door instead of her friend's door. And a stranger answered the door. And when they saw that it wasn't the person that they were supposed to kill, they gave up the murder plan and just left. And Susan Atkins was kind of aggravated and pissed off that they didn't get to kill the person that they wanted to kill. So she stopped and took a crap in the stairwell before they left. I'm not going to get into the whole story of the trial and the convictions and all that kind of stuff. But basically the bottom line is that they were arrested, not right away. They were arrested basically for theft of dune buggies. And then Susan Atkins was running her mouth in prison bragging about the murders that they committed. So that's how they ended up getting busted. So they were arrested, they went to trial, they were eventually convicted and given the death penalty. California changed the death penalty. They outlawed it. And all of the death penalty sentences that had been handed out were commuted to life in prison. California later reinstated the death penalty, but they deemed that it would be cruel and unusual punishment to return any of the people that had had death sentences back to death from life in prison. They thought that would be too cruel. So that's how Manson and the other family members that were involved in the murders, that's how they ended up doing life instead of doing time, and then ended up getting executed. Manson did a lot of interviews during his years that he's been locked up. If you're interested, you can go to YouTube, and a lot of those interviews are there for you to watch. I'm going to warn you, it is kind of scatterbrained and crazy to listen to. He doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He's a really out there kind of guy. I thought it was important to tell the early history of Manson and what led up to these crimes and made him come up with the whole helter-skelter, race war thing. I think a lot of it spawns back to his original biological father, them saying that his father was black. I think because of that, Manson held a lot of animosity towards black people. I think that inspired and fueled this insane philosophy that he came up with, that there was going to be a race war and that black people weren't going to be smart enough to be able to run the world after they had won the race war. I believe that really has a lot to do with it. That about covers the history of Charles Manson. And so now I'm going to throw over to Old Boy, and he's going to talk a little bit about his effect on pop culture and some more info on Manson. So, Old Boy, take it away, brother.
Thank you, brother. And what I'm going to say about Charles Manson is, look, a lot of people got to realize this guy was deranged and crazy, but he was also smart and brilliant, because not only did he get people to kill for him, see, the thing was crazy about this is he never killed anybody. He had people killed. There's rumors now he said he has killed people when he was younger, but they never could prove it because Manson always lied, or he always pretended to lie. See, the thing about Charles Manson is I lived in California. And another thing is what James might not tell you, we're friends with David Oman, who lives in the house where Sharon Tate was killed. So he's actually, not to get in the paranormal thing, is he actually talked to Sharon, had a conversation with her. And that's another story we could talk to, or he could talk about at the end of the show. Charles Manson was very smart. He got people to believe what he says. Because look, when he went to jail, he did some crazy interviews. People, for some reason, kept watching this guy. He did them over and over, not crazy. He stabbed his lawyer with a pen. He's done crazy stuff. He threatened to kill Diane Sawyer and other different newscasters. He also wrote books. He also made music. He also became very close to being famous in the music industry. Like I said, with the drummer from the Beach Boys, they say they stole a song from him. and they got a couple of his songs and they redid them and they made it their own. So this guy had a lot of influence to do and have people do what they did, go murder people for him. There was drugs involved, but he was that powerful of a person, an entity, that he could make people do things for him. And even when he was in jail, he was making books, selling T-shirts. Here's how popular Charles Manson was. Natural Born Killers and Woody Harrelson, they talk about Charles Manson and even says he couldn't top his ratings. Well, no one can top the king. Marilyn Manson got his name from Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson. He put them together. That's what the Marilyn Manson his other bands took other stars and killers and put their names together. That's where Marilyn Manson got that. He was intrigued with Charles Manson, and there's a bunch of people who bought his books. There's people I'd see that think that he's really not crazy, that the government he's really right about the government, because you guys always listen to Charles Manson. He's always talking about the government. Don't believe them. Don't trust them. They're crazy. I've actually seen an interview. He goes, they say that I'm crazy, but look at you guys all follow what they say. And he had a point, because some of the stuff he does say is out of his mind, out of this world, but some things he's right about. And he said this government does listen to us and watch us, and they make sure we're like in a cage. And he wasn't going to follow that life. He was a rebel. And he started that with his uncle. He lived in Kentucky because he ended up living with his grandparents and his aunt, and he didn't want to follow a decent life, so he started listening to his uncle, who was a hillbilly in Kentucky. Like I said, he was a rebel from the South. He said, don't trust the Yankees. Don't trust their reality. You know, they don't trust. A lot of people in the South don't like the North in the first place because of the war. It still goes on. People think it doesn't. It does. He always has had problems. The guy was crazy, but he knew how to make you believe what he was talking about. Not everybody. You know, a lot of people think he's out of his mind, and I do too. But I also think he's smarter than people think. I think he lies. He told people he got raped and this and that, and then on an interview he said he never did it. He was just saying that so the FBI would, so he could make money and stuff like that. And I believe that. I think he did make things up so that he could get more popular. He knew what he was doing. He knew that he could make money. Yes, he was crazy, but he knew that he had followers on the other side. And there is people that I know that like him. There's Facebook groups about killers. Charles Manson's one of the most popular killers. I mean, I don't even know why they call him a killer, because he had people killed. He never killed anybody, but I guess some people put it the same thing. He was one of the most popular convicts of all time. And it baffles me because he's crazy, and he has like a Nazi sign carved in his head. I don't know, if you look at the guy, he looks like he's insane, but then he says crazy stuff. But I think he does that for purpose because he's on TV and he knows millions of people and millions of people are watching him. I think that he knew that, and then when you go on YouTube, dude, I've seen 100 million on some of the people watching his interviews. So people know who he is. He's a household name. He made himself famous. A household. If you ask anybody who Charles Manson is, you know who he is. That's how crazy that. Yeah, he killed a movie star, had a movie star killed, and 6 other people, but he's known everywhere. He's like the most famous, whatever you want to call him, conspirator, murder, criminal ever. And it's so crazy because, like James said, he's such an interesting character. And I think why people did like him is he's so off the wall different. You'll try to talk to him, and then he'll change the whole thing 360 and make it crazy. But I think he does that because he doesn't want people to know how he really is. I think Charles Manson wasn't as crazy as people think. I think he did a lot of stuff. He knew what he was doing. That's what crazy people know anyway. They know how to work the system. They know how to make people believe they're garbage. And he did. And he even got people, after everybody knows what he did, he has people still liking him. Buying shirts, like James said, T-shirts. I've seen the T-shirt. I have people walking around. They like Charles Manson. I knew a kid that I lived in high school because I lived in the high desert in Victorville. He did the same thing. He carved the Nazi sign in his head. He loved Charles Manson. He had the shirt, and he was a Satanist, and he would run around doing crazy stuff. But he liked Charles Manson. He had his books and all that. Red Helter Skelter. And it was crazy. The guy idolized Charles Manson. So this guy is so popular that. And there's other people. There's like a guy made songs about killers, and he made a song about Charles Manson. There's other groups have made references to Charles Manson. They've made movies, documentaries. They've used references in horror movies with Charles Manson. This guy was just fascinating, like James said. When I would see him on TV, I would actually enjoy it because he's going to do something crazy. And you know he is. Like, he'd do some dance and flip in the air, and people ate it up. Especially in California. People got to realize California is a different breed of people. There's crazy people here, so people enjoy seeing that. You go to Hollywood, you see a lot of crazy stuff, especially in LA, wherever. There's crazy people like that. He's not the only one. He made it famous. My personal opinion is, he died. He deserved what he got. He shouldn't even, and we're not even getting into what I think about California's laws. I just sucks that we had to spend all this money, because I think it was millions of dollars a year. We had to have him separated, because there's people wanted to kill Charles Manson because they want a name, just like the guy who killed Jeffrey Dahmer. You kill Charles Manson, you got a name. And that's what people wanted to do. And he was actually married to somebody, I think, a couple people. It was crazy. He still had some Charles Manson followers. And up in the high desert, see, he used to wander all over the place. He used to hang out up here in Silver Lakes. Early 60s out here, there's a lot of hippies out here and stuff. So he blended in with anybody, and I think that's what happened. He blended in, and he got the right followers, and he was a cult leader, and he got people to believe him. He still does. He still got people. People were saying rest in peace to this guy. Millions of people. People still like this guy. I don't understand it, but that's how popular he was. My personal opinion is, sorry, bye, I don't care. See you later. I know people are going to get mad, but I don't care. He had people killed, so I don't feel one bit bad for him. He had somebody murdered, he had a kid in her stomach, and ruined her career, and killed her, and other people. Charles Manson is quite the character, that's all I'm going to say, and I've always been intrigued by him, but I think that's where they got the Natural Born Killer movie. They kind of inspire, it has a lot more, but they bring about Charles Manson a lot in that movie. It's just, he's crazy, and he brings crazy people out like that. So that's all I got to say. What do you say, James?
I think the magic of Charles Manson goes all the way back to when he was young, because he learned to be a pimp and a con man and a thief to survive. But especially the pimping and the con man aspects, he was able to get women to follow him and to be devoted to him and do whatever he said. And he used the women to get the guys, because he would use the lure of free sex to get the guys to come in, to be the muscle. Just that con man experience of BSing people and getting them to buy your line and crap, I think served him very well. I think that's the main thing, is he's a con man. And a lot of that stuff that he did in the interviews and stuff, a lot of it might have been just that. A large con. It's just for show. It's just to keep people interested. Or maybe he was absolutely out of his mind. I think probably the truth of the matter is somewhere in between. I think it's a little of each. The story about me talking to Sharon Tate's ghost. That's an interesting story. I'm friends with David Oman. He is a gentleman that lives in a house right there by where the Tate murders took place on Cielo Drive. The story goes that after the murders, that house was eventually torn down. The spirits did not have a place to be then. So they just kind of went to the other house that was pretty much on the property anyway. It's right there. So they just kind of migrated over to that house, and now they inhabit that house. And if you guys never heard of the Omen House, look it up on Google or whatever and read up on it. They've had all kinds of different ghost shows and all kinds of people there to do investigations of the home. And they even have documentation with the spirit box and stuff like that of people talking to Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger and Frykowski and all them on that property. I did a show with David Oman. I've done a lot of shows with David Oman, but after one particular radio show, we were actually talking about Manson. And after the show was over, I talked to him on the phone for, an hour, 2 hours, something like that. We were just gabbing. And during the conversation, we were interrupted by Sharon Tate. She butted into our conversation and started inviting me to come out to the house. She wanted me to come out there and stay for a while and come to the beach and all this kind of stuff while I was out there. Sharon Tate just kind of jumped into our conversation and started inviting me to do things. So I was able to talk a little bit to Sharon Tate, and it was kind of a surreal experience. I'm a guy that grew up fascinated with this case. I don't idolize Charles Manson. I think he was a sick puppy. I don't in any way think he was this awesome guy. But just the case itself was fascinating. The way he was able to capture the imagination of the entire world, instill that kind of fear in the rich and powerful, because what a lot of people don't realize is during that time period, the celebrities and the rich people were really freaked out. This kind of thing just didn't happen to them. It happened to normal people, but it wouldn't happen to a star. These were not average people that got murdered here. It would be like today if a bunch of billionaires got murdered. And people would be like, oh my God, what's going on? A bunch of billionaires just got murdered. It would freak everybody out. And that's the way it was then. People were really worried. And so you had all these celebrities that started getting all this extra security and everything where they never had it before. That's where the whole idea of having gated in mansions and personal security teams and bodyguards all the time, that wasn't a thing before Manson, because everybody was so worried that they were going to be next. We're just about out of time. This hour literally just flew by. So we're almost out of time, so I'm going to throw back over to Old Boy and let him do his shout-outs.
Yeah, thank you, brother. I want to thank everybody from Para-X who listens to us and all our other listeners or our YouTube followers. Thank you and Happy New Year. And I hope everybody has a great 2018. And just forget, if anything bad happened to you, just forget about it and just go for the next year. Because remember, you live in the past, you'll never have a good future. And I want to give out a shout out to my daughter, my family, Staring Into the Abyss. This is our 1 year anniversary this month. Just remember, you guys like our show, check us out on YouTube. Check out James Hershey's YouTube page. Subscribe. And if you guys remember, we're looking for sponsors and advertisers. So if you guys are interested, hit us up. Me or James Hershey, Old Boy James Ash on Facebook, or James Hershey on Facebook, or Twitter. We both have Twitter accounts. The same thing, James Ash and James Hershey Jr. So I want everybody to have a good night. I'm ready for a brand new year, an action-packed hour every week. I love you guys, and just remember, just love your life because you only live once. And good night, Misfits, Sugar Ladies, and Demon Hunters. I love you.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for listening. We really appreciate all the support you guys give us. I'm so glad that you guys are enjoying this and that you find value in this show. Anyway, thank you guys so much for all the support and all the love. Like Old Boy said, the YouTube channel is youtube.com/James Hershey Jr. Please go there and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the videos, and check them all out. Totally free. Enjoy it. Also, the Patreon page is patreon.com/James Hershey Jr. We're just getting that up and going, so if you guys enjoy the show and you want to help support it, then please go over to the Patreon page and pledge whatever you want to pledge. There's a bunch of different reward towers that I put up on there. I'm not exactly sure yet how Patreon works, so hopefully I'm not doing it wrong. I've never messed with it before, so I have no idea, but I'm trying to get it going right. Once we get some people that have gone and signed up for the Patreon page and we get that going, I'm going to start putting polls on the page so that you guys that are patrons of ours can actually vote on future shows that you'd like to see, and you'd be able to message us and talk to us and stuff like that to get some ideas that you might have for shows out there to us. So check that out. Basically, that's all I have to say this week. Thank you guys again, and until we speak to you again, love many, trust few, and do harm to none. We love you. Bye-bye.